We'll stay on immigration for a bit longer. The point you made about Keir Starmer's speech after those immigration figures were revised upwards from north of 700,000 in the year to north of 900,000 in the year, where he said it's an open border experiment. And this has added fuel to what you could say are quite common online right talking points, that replacement migration is going on as the demographics in the country change. But indeed, it's not just the online right. There are many who are unhappy with open borders, including immigrants and the descendants of immigrants themselves. And so I'm even spotting it amongst the so-called political normies who would typically get their information from BBC News, ITV News, and The Times, and things, publications and broadcasting organisations that would typically toe the line and not stray too far from whatever is deemed to be polite opinion. So you can almost feel that shift. I know you've talked about various policy instruments that might be pulled upon to deal with some of these waves of immigrants. What are they?
Sure. So let's take it back to the structural. So there are some really big things. I think we have to think really seriously about the human rights architecture we've got. That's broadly more of a problem with illegal, but there is still a problem sometimes with deportation of foreign criminals based on who come legally and then commit crime. So our human rights infrastructure has to change. That's the Human Rights Act. There are some elements of the Equality Act that have an implication there. The tribunal system that we have around immigration cases also is clearly in need of reform. But the most fundamental thing that I think we need to do, we do need to bring down the numbers. I think a parliamentary set cap is a crude way of doing it, but a way that would be broadly effective. And I think keep it, given the current crop of parliamentarians that we've got, keep it crude and easy. But there are also some short-term things that we need to start thinking about. So the current assumption of our migration system was built at a time when we had very few people coming in. The assumption, therefore, was that they would all want to become citizens and that they could all become citizens. Let's remember, when we're talking about tens of thousands of people a year, as we were at the beginning of the 20th century, then, okay, maybe your working assumption can be that people are going to come, they're going to do a bit of work, they're going to settle, and then they're going to become citizens. Immigration is at its most harmful when it is linked to citizenship, because what it does is it bakes in some of those decisions that policymakers make. So let's say we give you a visa at this moment in time, give you a work visa, 5 years. The automatic track that you're on is now as follows. 5 years, and then you can access what's called indefinite leave to remain. That gives you access to welfare, to social housing, waiting lists, to healthcare, etc. You're then on the path to citizenship. So you're on the path to being able to stay here permanently, and you can bring your family. That's just 5 years of work. So this is, as a certain American president would say, this is the worst deal in the history of deals, maybe ever, right? You come for 5 years, you do 5 years of low-skilled work, and then you can access the state's support forever, and you could potentially become a voting citizen. In many cases, you're already a voting citizen, because Commonwealth citizens could vote in the UK as well. So Indians who've come over the last 4 years could all vote automatically in UK elections. 1 million people, right? It's not a small number. 1 million new voters. In fact, it's more because you've got people coming from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Nigeria. So we've probably added about 2 million new voters over the last couple of years, all from abroad, all with very few ties to the nation that they are then going to be electing the representatives of. So, the thing you could do on day one is end Commonwealth voting. Clearly, that's inappropriate. It was, again, a rule designed at the time when the Commonwealth migrants were primarily a small number coming from Canada or from Australia, countries that had existed for about 5 minutes and were full of British people. So we're talking about a very different Commonwealth now. We're also talking about a very different immigration situation now. Second thing you could do, and this has been my big campaign at the moment, is you could just extend that ILR period. You could just say, okay, rather than 5 years indefinitely to remain, it's going to take 50. And if we want to take your visa away, we can. Because when you get that 5-year visa, there is no term or condition which says that visa has to be reissued ad infinitum if circumstances change. If we decide that we don't want somebody to come and work in a coffee shop for the next 15 years and then become a citizen, bring their family, cost the taxpayer hundreds of thousands of pounds over their lifetime, then we could just revoke that visa. We don't have to reissue it, right? You have no automatic rights to remain in the UK for the rest of your life. That is how immigration looks in large parts of the world. There is a severance between settlement, citizenship, and a visa. There is no access to state services whatsoever, and the overall numbers are lower. So I'm thinking of a country like Singapore. Singapore is a classic example of a great social contract which works fabulously. Ordinary Singaporeans feel that they're represented, even though many will say that it's not a democratic society. There is great popular support for the political settlement in that country, and certainly in economic terms, they're having a pretty good time. They do use guest labourers from Vietnam or from the other ASEAN countries, the Philippines, Indonesia, etc. And you go and you see it. You see people from the rest of Southeast Asia working in Singapore. They are there because a business has sponsored them to come there. If that person breaks their immigration conditions or they commit a crime, the business is fined and the person goes home. Right? Guess what? The immigration there is more orderly, right? Because businesses are incentivized to be really careful about who they're bringing over. You can't bring dependents. You don't have access to state support, so you've got to be fairly self-reliant. And actually, there is no link whatsoever because they're very precious about the native of their country, which is very delicate and which has caused them problems before. So they're very cautious around it. Japanese are the same. It's actually the same in countries like the UAE, Dubai. Right, majority of the population of Dubai are immigrants, but not citizens. The path to citizenship is very limited. What that does is it gives the political community that makes up the core of the nation state continued power over that nation state. Right? It stops the dilution of citizenship, and it stops immigration from being long-term harmful, and actually, in many ways, allows those countries to be more immigration liberal, but within strict confines.
The citizenship point is remarkable when you see how easily Britain gives out citizenship. I came across, it might have been in one of your articles, so I will caveat that in case I'm incorrectly sourcing this information, but side-by-side comparison with Japan, we know culturally a very different beast, but since the 1870s, I think, they have given out 600,000 citizenships, so naturalized Japanese citizens, whereas in the last 4 years, I think, maybe 5 years, Britain has given out 1.8 million
I think
citizenships.
That was
it yours?
Yeah, I think it was my tweet. So
yes.
Yeah,
yes, there you go.
You're right. You'll be pleased to hear.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad it was definitely yours. I'm also glad I got it right, and I wasn't spewing rubbish. I also am struck by, and let me know if you think this is also the case. I appreciate that there are lots of people who see the issue, and as you mentioned in your northern Welsh town, where I'm from in Northumberland, people typically say it how it is, and there's that big disconnect between not just the SW1 Westminster bubble, but just about anyone who passes as a cultural elite, liberal metropolitan, and just about everyone else. But what's interesting when you speak to people about the scale of immigration is it's almost become so normal to have such large numbers of people come in, and also to talk about something called immigration policy, that people see it as an engineering problem. And if only we could build more houses, then it's fine. Then we wouldn't have the competition for the houses, and it shouldn't really matter. And I don't know how they've become blinded by the cultural points and then the points you've raised, which is ultimately you're enfranchising people who may have very different interests and objectives that run counter to what a British state might want to achieve for its citizens. But it also makes me wonder why no one seems to actually ask what a country is for and what a country is. I don't quite understand why people think the solution is just to tarmac over more of England and build more housing estates. When you obviously spend quite a lot of time around the political class, do you, besides those who are more conservatively inclined. Do you ever really get a sense that anyone asks that question, or have they become blind to what makes a country, and specifically this country, and it's all just an engineering problem?
It's a really interesting question. I think for most people, the nation is a kind of economic unit. That's the primary way in which they think about the nation. I mean, it's worth remembering, just on one of the points you made there, if you poll people and ask how many migrants they think have come over in the last 5 years, right, the figure is like 100,000. People have got no idea, right? I mean, we're really talking about a public that is really angry about immigration and thinks that immigration is far lower than it is. So if that message were effectively communicated about the real scale, just imagine the tide of public opinion against the current policy that we've got. In terms of that question about the nation, most thinkers, most political thinkers, whether that's politicians, journalists, whatever, don't think about the nation state in those terms whatsoever, if they think about the nation state at all. There are those on the left who think about the nation state in terms of economics, but through a slightly different lens. They think about it through the lens of workers, and many of them will accept the legitimacy of borders. Lest we forget that there are passages of Marx where he excoriates the impact of Irish migration on English workers. So there is a kind of Marxist case there for border control, but the vast majority of people don't think about it in those terms whatsoever. They think in purely economic terms. And I say this as somebody who works for a free market think tank. I care a lot about economics. I do think we need to be building more. I am a kind of an economic liberal in some ways, in many ways. But I still have a very acute sense of the nation state, partly because I think that our tradition of economic and social and political liberalism is a feature of our national characteristics, right? It's not random, and nor is it intellectual. We didn't come at it through liberal philosophy. We have norms which lend themselves towards what we then post hoc call liberalism. That isn't true for most people in politics. They think first about whether we should be, if they're thinking about this stuff at all, whether we should be a country that is liberal, a country that is socialist, etc. But they think about that through a primarily economic lens. What grows the GDP line? Actually, most of them are not even thinking about that. They're thinking about their particular policy bugbears, like, if you work in healthcare policy, all you're thinking about is how do you get the waiting list down, right? And you don't need to therefore think about the wider implications of, okay, so if we bring in healthcare workers and then they settle, what are the impacts on the nation state as a whole? They're just thinking, well, as long as it gets the waiting list down, I've done my job, right? And I tick the box. So there's a lot of siloed thinking. And of course, a nation is hard to conceptualize because it's lots of different silos. It's hundreds of different silos, communities, sectors, policy areas, etc. The number of people thinking holistically about this within the Westminster space is small. They are there, I promise, but there are not very many of them.